on the communications challenge. And it is a big communications challenge. It's my honor to introduce Dr. John Abraham.
Thanks
John,
so much. Thanks, Paul, for that beginning here. So yesterday I gave a talk where I followed some musicians, and today I have to follow that guy. The scientists should always go first. I'm going to take a few minutes, about 20 minutes, and put some flesh on the bones of what Paul was talking about. And if people want access to some of the information that I've got, I'm happy to have it made available through the organizers of this. And thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak to you. So, what do we know? Well, every day, new science comes out. My colleagues and I are doing research and publishing our research in scientific journals. And it takes a lot of effort to read those journals and stay up to date. But fortunately, every 6 to 7 years, a summary is given. It's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I was one of the reviewers of the last report. Here are some of the highlights of that report. So this is Global Warming 101 or Climate Change 101. The warming is unequivocal. The last 3 decades have been warmer in sequence. Some extreme events, like Paul was talking about, have increased. Greenland is losing ice, decreased snow cover, sea levels rising, poles warming, glacier ice loss, and the ocean is becoming more acidic. So those are observations. Those are things we see. Those are things we measure. The question is, are they related? And what can we do about them? So as a scientist, we can go out and measure and come up with ideas about why these things are occurring. But in the end, we're also people. I mean, you know, I'm a scientist during the day. I play one during the day, but I'm also a human, right? I think so. And when I started giving talks about climate change around 2007 or 2008, I got this photograph, which meant a lot to me because I do a lot of work in Africa, bringing clean and renewable and robust energy systems to people who have no electricity. And by the way, night is dark. It's really dark when you have no electricity. This photograph speaks to me about justice, equity, and the color of the child's skin and the continent which is facing the photographer speak volumes. Because, by and large, people in the developing world are not that responsible for this problem. Yet, they are going to suffer disproportionately from this problem. We're going to suffer in the US, and we already are, but we have the financial and industrial capacity to adapt much more than folks around the world do. Now that's sort of abstract and intellectual argument, but this photograph took on profound personal influence or impact to me. A few years later, the left middle finger of that child ends on the country of Uganda, and I was fortunate enough to welcome into my family my adopted daughter from Uganda. And now it's personal, because now her birth country is suffering disproportionately. So let's talk about the science a little bit. This is one of the most famous graphs in all of science. And my wife tells me every graph that you put on your slides makes half the people fall asleep. So I'm going to try to keep the number of graphs to a minimum, but this is powerful. On the left-hand side of that graph, 1957, when these measurements began, and these are measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These are real data, real measurements. And year by year, the amount of carbon dioxide is going up. And we are now, as Paul mentioned, over the mark of 400. So we started at about 315 in 1957, and now we're over 500. There's no doubt greenhouse gases are going up. Well, where is it from? I mean, if we're going to make good decisions, we should at least know where it's from. Two of the most important sources for us, electricity. Coal makes just over 40% of our electricity and a third of our CO2 emissions just through coal. power plants. If you look at your electrical bill at the end of the month, every kilowatt hour, which is how it's measured, is equivalent to 18 cubic feet of CO2. So imagine taking all the air out of 18 cubic feet, filling it with carbon dioxide. That's for every kilowatt hour. 2 pounds. Another major source is transportation. Every gallon of gas burned in a car is 20 pounds of carbon dioxide. That's amazing because it's 3 times heavier than the liquid gas that went in your car. I mean, that's a profound amount. 173 cubic feet of space for every gallon of gas. Now, I don't put these up here to say that we should turn off all electricity, we should quit driving. I drove here. I drove in a very efficient car, but I still drove here. We're actually emitting, we're contributing to the emissions right now through the electrical system, the lights, and so forth. I'm not saying that we just stop electricity and stop driving, but if we're going to make good decisions about how to move forward, we at least need to know what the major sources are. So our temperature's going up. This is a graph from NASA. There are 4 or 5 groups around the world that measure temperature. They have temperature data that goes back to about 1880. Every black dot is the temperature for that year. Now you notice some dots are high, some are low, and that's sort of like weather. One year might be hot, one year might be cold. What we want to know is there a trend? Here are the hottest years on record, the top 11 in order. That's the top 11 going back to 1880. Is that a coincidence? Do you see that star in the upper right? That's this year. Paul mentioned that this year will be the hottest on record. It is virtually guaranteed. There's no way, barring a nuclear war or a huge volcano, that we won't hit this. So this is temperatures over the last 1,000 years. We're concerned about what we've seen in the last 100 or 200 years. That's what's going to happen by 2100. Why do we care? Well, we are already seeing the effects. I'm sure we all remember the heat wave and drought of 2012. It cost our country $35 billion in lost agricultural production. 2012, every state colored in red had their hottest year on record. The states in orange were just much hotter than normal. And then if you were in Washington, it was only slightly warmer. The average temperature, I mean, we're talking about temperature increases of maybe 6 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Why do we care about that when we go from minus 30 in January to 100 in June? This year was only 1 degree above average. 1 degree average did that. So when we talk about averages, a few degrees makes a huge impact. That was our drought situation. The darker colors are the more severe drought. This is from the U.S. Drought Monitor. They put out their data every Thursday. You can type in U.S. Drought Monitor. You can get this image. That's what our drought state looked like in 2012. Here's what it is more recently, and this is back at the end of July. It's actually worse now. California and the West Coast is in a severe drought. These things cost money. We are seeing the impacts on our agricultural business from these droughts. What else are we seeing? This image is a top-down view of the Arctic. The white part is the amount of ice that existed in 1980. It was the equivalent of the U.S., continental U.S. minus Arizona. That's how much ice we lost through 2005. That was 2007. And since then, we've lost Texas. So when you think about this in terms of the geographical scale that makes more sense to us, this is huge. It's hard to see, but there's a motorboat up here, and it's on looks like a lake. But That's actually a melt pond on top of Greenland. In the back is a Arctic ice sheet, which you can perhaps barely make out. What about the southern hemisphere? This is an image of Antarctica. There's the right-hand side, which is East Antarctica. We're not that concerned about East Antarctica. There's the west side, West Antarctica, which we're concerned about because it's unstable. In red is a call out of the Larsen B Ice Shelf. Here's what happened in a month and a half. There's a picture of it. There's some little black dots on the... Tim, where is the laser pointer here? Is it bottom green? There are little black dots. I'll do it over here. Uh-oh, I've got to aim. Okay, you can see little black dots on that ice sheet. Those are actually melt ponds. The first image is the end of January, February 23rd, March 5th, March 7th. That is an overlay of Rhode Island. An ice sheet the size of Rhode Island collapsed into the ocean in a month and a half. We're also losing ice on glaciers. Here's a photograph of the McCarty Glacier in Alaska. Photographs taken at 2 different times. The camera was in the same location. Here's Portage Glacier. On the left date is 1914, and on the right is 2004. More than 90% of glaciers worldwide are losing ice right now. If you live in the Himalayan region where you rely upon snowmelt, if you live in California where the water system relies upon stored ice melt, this is a big deal. If you live near the coast, it's a big deal. This is a topological map showing elevations above ocean. It's a little hard to see, but on the left is Asia, and on the right is a close-up of Bangladesh. Paul mentioned 150 million people live within 3 feet of sea level rise. That's what we expect by 2100. In Bangladesh alone, 20 million people live within 3 feet of sea level rise. We had trouble handling the refugees from New Orleans, and we're the biggest, richest country in the world. What do you do if you're India? This is southeastern U.S. Red is what's going to be covered with 1 meter sea level rise. That's 3 meters. Miami's gone. And that's 6 meters. And by the way, in some cases you can't just build a seawall. Miami's ground is porous. So the water just comes up right through the ground. So how do you plan, if you're a city planner, how do you plan for this? What is the cost, the societal and economic cost? Well, fortunately, there's something we can do. This graph shows how our emissions are projected to go upwards to 2050. And Paul had a great analogy. There's no silver bullet, but there's silver buckshot. A bunch of things that we can do to pull that emissions down. We can reforest the world. We know how to plant trees, actually. We've known that for a while. We can use our energy more wisely. We can go further on a gallon of gasoline than we go today. Think about just using our precious resources because they're precious. I mean, a gallon of gas is pretty cool. It's got so much energy. It can take an SUV, push it 60 miles an hour for 20 miles. How many cheeseburgers worth of energy is that? That's a lot. Doesn't it just make sense to use that precious resource more wisely? When I was young, I thought OPEC was the oil-producing countries. I thought OPEC stand for oil producing. Actually, no one produces oil. We extract it. No one's producing it. It's something that once it's gone, you can't use it again. Shouldn't we use it more wisely? I gave a talk in St. Cloud, and I was walking out, and a lady said, "Well, it's fine for you, you high-paid professor." I laughed at that. She said, "You can buy I had just bought a Honda Insight." She said, "You can buy a fancy Honda Insight. We can't afford that. The rest of us can't afford that." I said, "Ma'am, where's your car in this parking lot?" She pointed to her car. And it was a largish car. And I'm not making an ethical statement about buying large cars. I want to make an economic statement. I said, how many miles per gallon do you get of it? She says, about 15. And I said, how many miles have you driven on that car? She said, about 150,000. And I said, okay, so let's assume you've paid $3 per gallon of gasoline. And gas is hot and more expensive there. She says, oh no, I paid more than that. I said, I know, but I want to stack the cards in your favor. Let's say you paid $3 per gallon for all of that gas. I get more than 45 miles per gallon in my car. So I did the quick calculation. The difference in gas was $21,000. That was actually more than my car cost. The point is, when we use energy more wisely, when we can go further on a gallon of gas, when we can get more out of our lights per electron, we save money. Paul mentioned many things that you can do. You can talk to your representatives, talk to your friends, let people know this is an important issue to you. A lot has been done on climate change over the past 4 or 6 years. Yesterday, there was a huge announcement about the Keystone Pipeline. It was a long time coming. The U.S. has become a leader internationally in climate change. Minnesota is a leader in the U.S. Tell your elected officials at the state and national level that this is something that matters to you. People of the faith community have tremendous potential influence because you're not ivory-towered professors or green tree-hugging liberals. I mean, you may be, but you approach this from a very profound and powerful vantage point. Change is possible. I love this image. On the left is a rusty turbine, oil well on the right, beautiful, clean turbines. And then this is the Paul Douglas type Yankee ingenuity, a guy making algae-based biofuels. So, I'm a scientist, and you've seen just an intro to some of the science, and I work on this every day. In my day job, I study ocean warming. And as Paul mentioned, that's where most of the heat's going. But I'm also a dad. That's Lily. She's my wild child. She's 8 years old. She wants to be a paleontologist. Olivia just turned 10. She wants to be a vet. She's the redhead. She's the bossy one. So those are my 2 girls. And as I mentioned before, I'm fortunate enough to have done some work around the world trying to bring clean energy systems to the world. And we've had a chance to see this glorious world that we have. And some of my trips have led me to Uganda, and that last picture was my daughter in her orphanage in Uganda, and now she's a full-fledged Minnesotan. So I have these 3 daughters, and they are going to ask me one of 2 questions when I get older. Dad, you knew what was happening. What did you do about it? Or they're going to say, Dad, how did your generation find the uncommon courage to take action to preserve God's gift of this world for us? And I desperately want my 2 daughters to ask me that second question and not the first question. This is about our kids, ourselves, and our natural world. So I've got just 2 slides left. I've talked a lot, given some science. What are the takeaway messages? These are the 4 messages to remember. 1, we know. Scientists have actually known about the greenhouse gas effect for over 150 years. Al Gore didn't invent the science of climate. So he didn't invent climate science. We can solve it. We can solve it today. U.S. emissions are going down. They've been going down for about a decade. We can do this. We don't need fairy dust. We don't need, but I wouldn't turn away, divine intervention. And we don't need cold fusion. We can solve it today. If we're smart, and this is one of the reasons Paul and I spend our time giving talks, because we want to make smart decisions. We want to make decisions that will solve the problem, but also create jobs, diversify our energy supply, improve our national security. We want to make smart decisions. And then finally, some people will say that it's too expensive to do anything. I think it's too expensive not to do anything. Superstorm Sandy cost us $88 billion. The drought of 2012 cost us $35 billion. The year before that, we had a drought in Texas, which cost $6 billion. If you were a Texan, it was a working Texan, it cost you an average of $600 that one year. We're experiencing drought in California. And then there's international issues. I mean, this is a connected world, a connected economy. Article was out in CNBC just 2 days ago about the rising cost of food around the world. So this has societal and economic consequences. Doing something now to stave off the worst effects, which are going to make today's effects pale, is the fiscally wise thing to do. I'm going to leave you with these three quotes from leaders in the Catholic faith tradition. But as Paul mentioned, and he had some other faith leaders, this creation care movement is powerful. There are many voices joining together. And that combined with what we've been doing the last 4 to 6 years gives me tremendous optimism that more can be done. So I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak.